From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead for you today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about fall harvest progress as an increasing influence on grain price movements currently. And Dan will comment on the improvement in biofuels production profitability as a grain market factor during his weekly segment on the grain price trends. Then K-State's Sarah Lancaster and Tyler Meyeres will talk about Kansas soybean growers' intentions on planting herbicide-resistant soybean varieties this coming spring, based on a new survey K-State's conducting, and they report on a new study of how off-target dicamba drift impacts non-dicamba-resistant beans. Later on then on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, plus more, here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Welcome once more to another Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. Appreciate you being along as we'll delve into those grain markets once again and get the comments of grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, joining us as always from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. First off, something that's fairly general, Dan, but it's becoming more evident as a market factor. That is, we've harvest pressure on prices, at least on a day-by-day basis, including the trade yesterday.
Yes, you can see corn futures having dropped from a high of just about 380 down to yesterday's close about 363. And actually, given we have dry weather, we're rolling in the fields pretty quickly in central Kansas for sure, and parts of southeast Kansas is what I could see earlier than that, and coming into the west almost underway up here. And for wet corn, we've been cutting that for a while and seeing at the feedlots out in our part of the world. In terms of local supply-demand pressures, when you have trucks lined up outside of local elevators or hauling to their own on-farm storage and being ready at a moment's notice to pull the trigger to do so, to haul those elevators, ethanol plants, you name it, you have some weakness in harvest basis anyway. I think you can see that when you look at the ethanol plant bids too. For Kansas, bids range from 35 under the D's contract to 5 over, and we've been running 20, 30, 40 over for weeks, basically. So that's kind of transformed the top end of the Kansas ethanol plant basis bid from what had been the highest bid overall in the country, literally on a state basis, down to 5 over. And you see other states, again, Indiana, Ohio in particular, at 28 to 25 over, even in Iowa, even to 7 over. And interesting also to see in South Dakota, Wisconsin, 30 under. So to a degree, that's almost a barometer for what's happening out in the fields in those areas. How strong do those ethanol plants feel they have to bid? So that's interesting. Also telling on the ethanol plant side is that there is no bid that we have recorded anyway for yesterday's report, September 24th, on grain sorghum going to ethanol plant. So still focusing on the export side on grain sorghum.
Want to come back to some information that you've worked up on the current profitability in biofuels production, but bolstering these markets yet, the grain sales largely to China. Might note that there was a brief interruption in that string of several days where China was aggressively in the feed grain and soybean markets. Nonetheless, that is really helping these markets remain somewhat steadfast in the midst of potential harvest pressure.
So here we were talking about a 20-cent drop in these corn futures at harvest time. Well, gracious sakes, if we wouldn't have the strength we have in general in the export markets, would it be only 18 to 20 cents? And instead of looking at these corn futures in around On yesterday's close, 363, while in the midst of what could be a sizable harvest. Where does that go? Mm-hmm. It's surely below 350. Yeah. So the underlying support there is positive. When you look at both sorghum and corn for forward sales, we're about 3 weeks into the current marketing year. There are forward sales ahead of about 38% for this 2.325 billion bushels of corn that USDA is projecting for this marketing year running September 1 this year to next August 31st. And for grain sorghum, it's 42%. So even though the weekly numbers right now aren't that great and they've been fluctuating, still the forward purchases are strong. And I would say for wheat, now here we're basically, for hard red winter wheat, we're about 16 weeks into this marketing year, about 31% of the way in, and we've got about 45% of the USDA's projection, 410 million bushels bought. And actually for overall, all U.S. wheat, which means there's some other classes doing a little bit better. Again, 16 weeks in, about 31% of the way through and 51% of the way bought ahead. That's a combination of what we've shipped so far and what's out there coming. So still the maintenance of some optimism in the wheat markets. And I think it's telling also that in the midst of harvest pressure, we've saw corn drop 20-some cents over the last several days. We've seen some weakness in soybeans. For wheat, we saw 1 or 2 cents lower. Wheat kind of holding up strong. And so you've got this puzzle internationally of who has a good crop and who doesn't. And you get out of the Black Sea region, you'll have independent analysts say, oh, we got problems. The government will come out and say, oh, it's just wonderful. So I think we've seen this before.
Right.
I would say, as we're talking about wheat, before we go to beans, that there's a major report coming out Wednesday of next week. It's the annual small grain summary. For us, we watch the wheat numbers out of all that. That same day, there'll be stocks numbers for soybean export sales. So here we're 3 weeks into a 52-week mark, and you're just about 6% of the way there. We have new crop sales of 61% of the USDA's projection, 2.125 billion bushels. So we wonder where the strength in the soybean market has come from. Well, in the midst of harvest, you've got China with all its issues and everybody else in the world figuring out what's a good buy, what's not. And at the same time that Argentina and Brazil have their own particular issues. One's out of soybeans, the other has internal problems. That'd be Argentina. So with all of that, we're basically 1.3 billion bushels of the way to this USDA's projection of 2.125 with not a lot of other places in the world to go. We had a KSU put together some scenarios on where prices could go in soybeans. And really for me, it's kind of taking and scaling up 100 million, 200 million or more bushels of soybeans sold and figure out where that goes. Right now, the USDA is projecting for this marketing year, price about $9.25. It seems as you keep moving up that curve for the first 100 million bushels, it looks to me like you'd go from $9.25 to $9.75, so about 50 cents. For the next one, you're getting tighter and tighter, and it's a nonlinear relationship going up. You're going up about $1.25 then to about 11. And if you get off into next year, basically if U.S. soybean production this year in those dry areas, and they still are extremely dry in Iowa, in Indiana, Ohio, and we have surprises elsewhere. They had the windstorm that stripped things up. Say we drop 250 million bushels, 250 million bushels off of that and tighten things up, then with the demand we've already got, then you're getting down to basically a 5% stocks to use, and we're looking at $12 beans or something thereabouts again. So although we're pretty docile right now in terms of this, here we have this demand and uncertainty as to where the beans are going to go. There's a potential for a fair amount of support for these markets and some real volatility in coming months.
What you're saying, Dan, is that there is a good chance that the bean trade will at least stay north of $10 for a time.
Well, I guess if we're looking at the data, test that on. Yesterday it closed right on $10. Right. So we're going to be able to answer that question, Eric, pretty readily, because yesterday November beans closed exactly at 10. So where do we go from here? And harvest is right ahead of us. If we come through harvest and we do not see that thing break lower, then you'll know, my goodness, there's a supply issue or demand's continued, and the market is worried about having enough supplies to really fulfill the U.S. and world demands.
Want to quickly circle back and lend just a few more details, Dan, on the profitability in biofuels production. You've worked up the numbers, and that profit level is on the mend, you say.
Yes. Over the last several months, ethanol plants haven't been losing as much money as they had been. On a per gallon basis, in the midst of the COVID-19 things, we were dropping 12, 15 cents per gallon loss, and you were seeing closures and delays and refittings and all sorts of things. Well, we've come back some, and a lot of that was on the strength of the economy improving and bringing up ethanol prices some and lower corn prices. So on monthly averages running July, August, September, we're basically kind of locked in at about break even to about 3 cents loss. Now, it was really something to see what happened to all of that in this most recent week that we had that finished on September 18th. Suddenly, the corn price jumped up to about $3.50. And given where everything else was, then suddenly that 3 cents per gallon loss dropped to about 19 cents a gallon. That was a 1 week deal, but that just shows how sensitive the profitability of those plants are to what happens to corn prices. So, farmers would want the higher prices for sure, but there's a reaction to higher prices. It tends to make those who purchase the input, they have less profitability in what they're doing. So right now we have kind of a fine balance going on. We want all sorts of bushels to feed these uses. By golly, if we don't, the price raises up and we start to choke off the demand. So here we are in the midst of a harvest season, and we have things just tight enough that we're balancing supply and demand and wondering how to thread the needle to maintain usage while still holding up prices at a decent level. So we shall see.
As you said earlier, we will, come next time we visit, have a bucket full of new USDA numbers on wheat planting intentions, on supply and demand. So we will take all of that up as we talk next week. Dan, thanks, as always.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
The weekly grain market analysis and comment from grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. And producers, feel free to glance at his updated notes on the markets. Those are posted each Friday at agmanager.info. In a moment, useful new information from our next guests on soybean variety reactions to dicamba drift. That's straight ahead here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and now to talk soybean weed control, and specifically some of the matters of interest that have come up with herbicide-resistant soybeans. Our two guests have been involved in research and communication on this very topic, and they'll talk it over with us now. Sarah Lancaster is a research and extension weed management specialist at K-State. Joining Sarah is a graduate researcher in the Department of Agronomy here at K-State, Tyler Meyeres, who has conducted some work on the impact of dicamba drift, if you will, on non-dicamba soybeans. We'll get into that in just a moment. First, though, Sarah, you have been very interested of late as to what growers think about herbicide-resistant technology in soybeans and their receptiveness to that, given some of the issues that have revolved around it.
That's right, Eric. When the court ruling on dicamba came down this summer, one of the big questions in my mind was how is this going to impact growers' thoughts on variety selection for 2021? And so I've put out through the e-update and social media channels here in the last couple of weeks a short survey for growers. It's actually still up and running, so if anybody wants to add their 2 cents, I'd love to have it. But that survey was asking really two things of growers. What are your thoughts on herbicide-resistant soybeans for next spring, and what are the factors influencing those thoughts? And so the big takeaway is that a little over 64% of the respondents so far say that they're planning on going with the Extend system and using dicamba. And about 30% say that they're planning on going with the Enlist system and using 2,4-D in their post-emergence herbicide applications. So this is setting us up again for some potential herbicide injury scenarios next summer as we think about off-target movement, particularly of the dicamba injuring those Enlist soybeans.
You say that you were interested in the factors behind those choices as well. Have you been able to ascertain those yet?
So the preliminary results there tell me that about half of farmers are considering the presence of herbicide-resistant weeds in their field as a factor when they're choosing their herbicide systems. So that was the most common factor that farmers cited. The second factor was the uncertainty surrounding the herbicide labels for next spring, surrounding those dicamba labels for next spring. And about 40% of the respondents said that uncertainty was playing a role in their decision-making process. And then just under 20% mentioned that the restrictions were playing a role in their decision-making process. And by restrictions, I'm talking about the various label restrictions associated with 2,4-D and dicamba. They have some similar restrictions, but they also have some differences.
Now, this information gathering is in progress. You say you've obviously quite a few months before soybean planting season here in Kansas. So you want further responses, you say?
That's right. I would love to have some additional responses. We've been pushing the link for the survey out via Twitter and Facebook, as well as through the Extension Agronomy e-update. So folks can look forward in those locations, or feel free to reach out to me if you're interested. I'll be happy to get you the information you need to complete the survey. But I would like to have it run at least through the end of September.
Very good. Agronomy.ksu.edu to follow up and provide this information. Something that you addressed in a recent virtual field day, though, Sarah, that aligns with this, the similarities and differences between the two technologies, the dicamba-resistant beans and the 2,4-D-resistant bean varieties.
That's right. So first I want to start out by one of the big similarities between these two systems, okay? So I just did a really quick and dirty analysis of some of the data that we collected this summer on weed control, and I looked at overall control of Palmer amaranth about 2 to 3 weeks after dicamba-containing products were applied or after Enlist was applied. And really, there's no difference in the amount of weed control. In both of those systems, in both Extend and Enlist systems, we were able to get about 95% or greater weed control. But the key here, Eric, is that we were using good pre-emergence herbicides in those systems. So I really want to encourage growers to think hard about using effective pre-emergent herbicide systems in their soybeans, regardless of which herbicide trait they choose. That's going to be one of the keys to not burning out these new herbicide-resistant technologies that we have, is using those pre-emergent products.
Well, Tyler's been patient enough to await her turn here to talk of research that she's conducted looking at soybean variety response, and in this case, non-dicamba-resistant soybeans, to inadvertent applications of dicamba, as would happen in a drift scenario. Tyler, would you further outline your work here?
So we looked at 4 different soybean varieties that are commonly grown in Kansas, the first being an Asgrow 4135, Roundup Ready to Yield, a Credenz 3841, Liberty Link, and a Credenz 4748, Liberty Link, and lastly, a Stein 40BA02, which is the predecessor to the GT27 beans. So that means it's resistant to both glyphosate and isoxafludol.
And what were you expressly looking for here in as far as impact of dicamba applied to these varieties?
So we were looking at applications at V3 and R1 at a diluted rate. It's approximately 1/100th of a 1x field use rate, which happens to be about half a pound of acid equivalent per acre. So we were just wanting to see if there's actually any differences among the varieties, and especially when it came to yield, which is obviously the most important factor. Mm-hmm. We found that there weren't any differences among the varieties. They did express different injury at different times. For example, the Stein variety showed more injury than the other varieties, but when it came down to the yield, They were all similar, and we attributed any differences in yield to the differences in variety, not necessarily the effect of the dicamba application.
So the actual end performance of those varieties similar, but you were able to pin down the stage of plant development at which that injury can be most acute, right?
Yes. So R1, or the beginning flower stage, is the most sensitive stage to the soybeans. It's important to avoid stress at R1 as it can cause flower abortion, which when flowers are aborted, you can't have pods come on. So that really ultimately impacts your yield. But in general, those reproductive stages are a lot more sensitive than what you see in those early vegetative stages. But of those reproductive stages, R1 is always the most sensitive and has the most impact on yield.
Sarah, bring you back in. Knowing that nugget, if you will, from this research, can that be an important tool in the producer's toolbox in as far as employing these systems?
Absolutely. So, as we think about some of the restrictions in terms of application timing for dicamba, a lot of states have gone to either calendar date cutoffs or, perhaps some soybean growth stage cutoffs. And so, there's a little bit of speculation that there might be some stricter growth stage cutoff language on the new dicamba labels, but I can't predict what the EPA is going to say. But as far as management perspective, talk to your neighbors and be aware of the growth stage of your soybeans so that when those off-target movement events do occur, you can kind of know what to expect as you move towards harvest. Something else that Tyler found that I thought was pretty interesting, and I'll let you talk about this some more, Tyler, was the effect of multiple applications. She did a companion study to the variety study and looked at 3 different application timings.
Within the given season.
Within a single season.
In case there's a potential for a follow-up treatment of a given weed within that system. And what did you find out about those multiple treatments then, Tyler?
So I'll just go into the trial itself. So we looked at applications at V3, R1, and R3. So we threw in that R1's most sensitive timing. And so then we had a V3 followed by an R1 application, a V3 followed by an R3 application, an R1 followed by the R3 application, and then a combination of all 3 application timings. We also did 3 different rates. So we had a 1/1000th, a 1/500th, and a 1/100th of that field use rate. And honestly, that 1/1000th, even at all 3 application timings, the yield loss was pretty minimal. And for the 1/500th, it wasn't as severe as you would think, but that 1/100th resulted in about a 53% yield loss at all 3 application timings. Those beans, when that applied at R1, they didn't have a chance to recover, but it was a single application of V3. It was less than 5% yield loss. So that could honestly be attributed to other environmental factors.
So in closing, Sarah, producers are going to have to sharpen their management of these systems and to make them work effectively and to assure no damage from inadvertent drift to their neighbors' crops. Lots to ponder here as they map out their weed control intents for 2021.
Absolutely, Eric. A lot of things to consider. And, I would just encourage guys to visit with their neighbors and at least know what other folks are doing so that you can adjust applications accordingly, assuming we get those dicamba labels for 21, which is the assumption we're operating under at the moment.
Stewardship of the technology, that's what it's going to have to be all about from here forward.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Thanks to the both of you for talking over these principles of that very thing with us right here.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Along with us from the Department of Agronomy here at Kansas State University, Research and Extension Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster and graduate researcher Tyler Meyeres. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Now a check on today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue this week said he is hopeful that China can meet its purchase commitments of U.S. farm products via the Phase 1 trade deal by February, the end of the first year of the deal. But Perdue said it's going to be tough for them to meet those numbers, $36.5 billion in the first year. He did add that number might be reached by the end of January before Brazil and South America come back into the marketplace. While there are hefty export sales on the books, Perdue said he wants to see shipments, saying that China is known for booking and later canceling sales. He says it doesn't appear that they're not trying, but it remains to be seen if we will make those numbers or not, in his words. Now, data for the week ending last Friday from the USDA included these export sales figures for China for 2021 now. Net sales of 556,000 metric tons of corn, 262,000 metric tons of sorghum, 1.8 million metric tons of soybeans. However, net reductions of 600 metric tons of wheat. For 2020 itself, the USDA is reporting net sales of 3,400 metric tons of beef and 8,100 metric tons of pork. The Coronavirus Food Assistance Program and Market Facilitation Program efforts have now caught the attention of WTO members. Canada, the EU, India, Australia, Brazil, New Zealand, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Colombia all used a WTO session this week to criticize the U.S. efforts. They're calling on the U.S. to explain the around $34 billion in what they consider trade-distorting payments in 2019. The WTO cap for those amber box subsidies is $19 billion. The countries also questioned the $14 billion CFAP2 program, which was announced last Friday. But the countries also raised questions about the aid the EU is providing to its farmers in response to the pandemic situation, indicating that all countries have taken actions to help their producers in the wake of the pandemic. The U.S. inventory of all hogs and pigs on September the 1st was 79 million head. That was down 1% from June of last year, the USDA reported yesterday. Here's more on that report from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
In Thursday's USDA quarterly hogs and pigs report, total inventories as of September 1st are about 1% larger than a year ago, but the rest of the numbers in that report mostly down. Sows farrowing during the June through August quarter down 3%, pigs per litter down from a year ago, first yearly decline since 2014. The summer quarter pig crop 3% smaller, and the report says producers intend to cut farrowings this fall by 5% from a year ago and this winter by 1%. USDA livestock analyst Shale Shagam told us the reasons are first logistical.
The sector still is adjusting to what happened earlier in the year. So, they are still working through probably some of this backlog.
The other factor, of course, financial.
Returns to farrow finished producers have been negative for 7 of the past 8 months.
But in the last few weeks, Shagam says demand has strengthened. Hog and wholesale pork prices have been rising, and that may have already changed producers' farrowing and production plans. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And attorneys general in 7 states and 2 agriculture groups will be allowed to file amicus briefs in a lawsuit challenging the USDA rule that eliminated line speed limits at pork packing facilities. The Food Safety and Inspection Service finalized that rule, cutting the number of federal inspectors at swine plants by 40%. The court is scheduled to hear all parties' motions for summary judgment on this on October the 13th. Well, if there are silver linings to the shutdowns caused by the pandemic, one might be the consumer's reconnection with the kitchen, and more specifically, home baking. Flour sales have boomed over the last several months, and Marcia Boswell tells the story of how one Kansas-based flour miller has adjusted to keep up on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
In early 2020, wheat flour sales were continuing a long-term slump. Then COVID-19 hit. Suddenly, stay-at-home orders began to be issued across the nation. People started hoarding toilet paper, and there was a run on flour in the stores. How did the industry respond? One Kansas flour miller adjusted rapidly, doubling its flour production capacity. The achievement was so remarkable that this company was recognized as an ag hero by the Kansas Department of Agriculture during the 2020 Ag Growth Summit. Bob Mirando is the CEO of the company known as Farmer Direct Foods. He grew up in Abilene and studied milling science at K-State. His career took him all over the country, working for businesses such as General Mills, Kraft, and ConAgra. Farmer Direct Foods had begun back in 1988 as a cooperative of white wheat growers, organized to help producers earn a premium for better quality wheat. In 2003, they built a flour mill in New Cambria near Salina. Identity assurance is a key concept at Farmer Direct Foods. He said we work with some 50 growers across the state. Some are 4th or 5th generation farmers. We work with them so that we can know what farm the wheat came off of. People want to know where their food comes from. Farmer Direct Foods sells to large bakers such as King Arthur Company as well as Tortilla King in Moundridge, home bakers, local bake shops like Radina's Coffee House in Manhattan and the Friendship House in Wamego, and even pizzerias in Chicago. However, flour sales nationally were at a 5-year slump as of early 2020. Then everything changed. As the pandemic spread and stay-at-home orders were issued, Bob suddenly started getting calls. He said we were running out of flour. The supply chain got a jolt from the sudden surge in home baking. It felt like things changed overnight. Farmer Direct Foods moved quickly to respond to the market. He said, fortunately, we had just placed a big order for flour bags, so we had supplies to meet demand. K-State canceled in-person classes due to the pandemic, so Bob called his old friends in the milling science department. He asked if all the kids are freed up, could a couple of them come work for me? He also located a couple of recently retired flour millers who were willing to come back onto payroll. He said 5 days later, we had doubled our production capacity. The mill was now running 2 shifts 6 days a week. Since then, the company has been going full speed to respond to the demand. He said we have not let off the gas pedal since March. We went from 18 trucks a month to 45 trucks a month. Normally, we make 12 million pounds of flour a year. This year, we're on pace to make 20 million. The working relationship with K-State milling science students went so well that Bob has decided to make the internships with the department an ongoing program. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll return shortly here on Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Concluding this Agriculture Today, it's our time set aside every week to get into the Kansas agricultural weather scene. Aboard once again, Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. Is rain in our future? That is the prime question right now, Mary. And coming off of 2 running weeks now of dry conditions in the state.
Well, there is a frontal system coming through this weekend. We're going to have some pretty warm days in advance of that, but then a sharp drop-off in temperature. That can trigger some storm activity, but the odds are not particularly high. In the eastern part of the state, they've gone to about a 20 to 30% chance of rain Sunday night into Monday. Of course, you flip that, and that's a 70 to 80% chance that it won't rain. And also, it's not very suggestive of squeezing a lot of moisture out of this. This is going to be coming out of the northwest, drier air generally in train with that, so it's reliant on whatever moisture is in place. And after 2 dry weeks, there's not a whole lot of moisture in place. A lot of the vegetation is now starting to go dormant. We're getting ready for harvest, so it's not pulling that subsoil moisture out and throwing it into the atmosphere either. So again, not a lot of encouragement as far as the rains go.
So have our drought conditions intensified in the state?
We have had a slight shift in the drought monitor, not a huge jump because we are getting into our drier season, and temperatures were cooler than average, so the evapotranspiration demand was not as high as it would typically be. So what we did see was some expansion of abnormally dry conditions in the northwest and parts of the central going into the east central area of the state, and some creep, if you would, of the moderate drought in the west. I anticipate a much bigger shift next week because, again, we're going on our third week of dryness because there's really not any significant rains on the horizon.
Back to this weekend outlook, though, a couple of warm days ahead, and these may be the last such days for a time.
Right. We are expecting temperatures into the 90s. We were hitting the 90s out in western Kansas yesterday. That's going to progress a little bit further east, and we should see 90s even as far east as here in Manhattan. Nighttime lows are staying in the 60s in the east, but dropping down into the 50s in the west. Again, an indication of that drier air that's in train in the western part of the state. As we get that cold front pushing through, we'll be hard-pressed to get highs in the 60s in the eastern part of the state as we start next week and as we move into October.
But western Kansas may see 60s, 70s likely?
They're looking at maybe 60s, 70s, but much cooler than normal. The 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks both call for that colder than normal trend to continue. The 6 to 10 day has the strongest signal in it, but it also carries out into that 8 to 14 day outlook. On the precipitation side, not a whole lot of good news on that either. It is suggestive of drier than normal for, again, both the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 day outlook, which is a continuation of that drier pattern.
Tie that into the fact that our row crops are trying to finish. Corn is pretty much there. Soybeans and grain sorghum, though, have a bit of a ways to go. So how this dry and these warmer conditions for the short term are impacting that progress is of interest.
Especially the fact that we're talking warmer and windier might help finish the dry down for the corn, could also help with the soybeans, getting them a little bit further on their road to completion. Sorghum, we've got a little bit further to go on that, and the couple of days are not likely to make a major impact against the cooler temperatures that are looking to finish next week and start October. So that's going to be an issue.
Those lows in the 40s are going to slow that grain sorghum down in all likelihood.
Right, but I think a lot of the sorghum crop now is getting towards maturity, and so that's going to be field-to-field basis as to how much it's going to have an impact on that. And in fact, Ignacio Ciampiti is going to have an article on the potential damage from our earlier cold spell on the sorghum in this week's Agronomy E update.
And you're referring there to that freeze of a couple of weeks back. So as we talk about this cool down, we're not suggesting a widespread freeze or our first broad freeze of the fall, are we?
No, we're not. At this point, that doesn't look like we'll hit sub-freezing temperatures. It's going to be more the high temperatures are not going to be what we would typically expect as we start October. But if we look at the outlook for the month of October as a whole, it suggests that after this cool start to October, we would move into more seasonal and even warmer than normal temperatures to finish out the month. So the outlook for October is warmer than normal and drier than normal.
which again creates worry about that winter wheat crop in particular. We're hinging our hopes basically on the stray tropical storm that might provide us some sort of moisture. That's where we're at right now.
Right now, that's unfortunately where we're at. And we did have some hopes with the tropical systems that made their way ashore in the Gulf of Mexico earlier this week. But unfortunately, they kind of stalled out over the Texas Gulf Coast and then just fizzled away and never really made it that far even into Texas and Oklahoma, and certainly didn't make their way up to Kansas with the moisture. We would watch also for some activity in the eastern Pacific because that tends to have a better chance of making it into the central plains as opposed to the Atlantic systems at this time of the year.
Well, let's hold out hope for such a development. In the meantime, Mary, thanks and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Joining us each Friday right here to talk Kansas agricultural weather, climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State Research and Extension. Thanks to you as well for joining us. Please be back with us on Monday, won't you? Until then, have a good weekend as well. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.